Furr family and all the co-sponsors and sponsors that were listed, and especially to James, who has worked very hard in putting this together. Events like this are very exciting, and this is an important subject. All of us here are concerned about helping the poor and oppressed and putting an end to corporate, political, and financial corruption. But how can and how should that happen? This is where disagreement begins. And since 20-25 minutes is barely enough time to define key terms, let's just try and focus on some of these terms. So let's start with the word just. My dad has a really nice 50-inch ZTR mower, a two-stroke engine, and I, on the other hand, have a small electric push mower. And at times I feel jealous, and I'm even tempted to say, you know, this is unjust. Why does he have this nice big lawnmower and I don't? He barely uses it anyway. And I might speak about inequality, or even that sinister term, greed. But I hope it's obvious that simply because there is a difference in inequality in two people's possessions, that doesn't necessarily mean there is injustice somewhere. My dad bought the mower with his own hard-earned money in a mutual, voluntary, legal transaction. He also made the choice freely. Now, if my dad stole the lawnmower, or if someone else stole the lawnmower and gave it to him, or if some political friends of my dad voted to criminalize my ownership of a lawnmower, but not my dad's, then maybe we could talk about injustice. But as it stands, no person has been wronged or forced to do something. Justice, then, has more to do with human beings treated as human beings in various situations than it does of an order of society conforming to some contemporary ideal, like everyone owning a house with a garage, having steak in the freezer, and possessing quote-unquote affordable health care. Justice is when people act in and out of a community of freedom, trust, and mutual exchange, as they were created to do. Injustice is when someone has been wronged, their rights have been violated by another person or group of persons. Now, I realize it's very trendy in academia these days to look down upon the concept of human rights, especially natural rights. And it's no surprise why. We have the UN Declaration on Human Rights saying everyone has a right to a periodic paid vacation, the Supreme Court saying gay marriage is a fundamental human right, and millions of citizens thinking the same about insurance, something billions of people have never had for millions of years. In short, human rights have become an almost meaningless concept. Furthermore, individual human rights are also criticized, especially by Marxists and others, for being a toxic vestige of Enlightenment thought that gave rise to today's individualist, egotistic, consumer-driven society. Yale philosophy professor Nicholas Walterstorff has laid much of this popular narrative to rest in his excellent book, Justice. And I'll just say that I think rights are real and a legitimate way of approaching our subject. We just have to define and delineate rights more carefully instead of throwing it all away. So what are rights? Walterstorff says they are normative social bonds. Language of rights, he says, quote, enables the oppressed to bring their own moral condition into the picture. Judge Andrew Napolitano, a Supreme Court Justice of the state of New Jersey, libertarian, Roman Catholic, he also says that rights reflect basic human yearnings. Now, whatever nuance one gives, contrary to Marx and others, There we go. Scary there. Rights are inherently social, not egotistic. They assume human relationships and protect them. Now, an important distinction in this topic is the difference between natural rights and political or socially conferred rights. Natural rights are those that people have by virtue of being creatures. They cannot be granted or taken away by anyone. They're natural. Political or conferred rights, on the other hand, are those instituted by social entities like people, businesses, churches, governments, etc., like the right to vote or the right to serve on an executive board. And these come and go. For example, my wife, Jessica, has sometimes taken away my right to speak. So, but anyway, second distinction is between negative and positive rights. Negative, or freedom rights, require the inaction of others. I have the right to be free from physical violence, rape, having my property damaged, etc. Positive or benefit rights require the action of others. I have the right to receive education, have a job, but this requires that these opportunities be made available to me. Now, there are three very, very important implications from these basic distinctions. First, negative rights are obviously more important than positive rights. What good is a job if you've been killed? What good is a house if it can be stolen from you? Positive rights are superfluous without negative rights. Second, it is immeasurably more difficult to fulfill positive rights than it is to fulfill negative rights. For example, what would it take to not murder millions of people? Nothing. Inaction. Virtually no resources required. What would it take to provide education, housing, jobs, and protection for everyone? An insurmountable amount of resources and labor. Third, positive rights generally cannot be enforced without violating negative rights. As you already heard, fulfilling positive rights requires a huge amount of resources and labor. Where's that going to come from? How is everyone's right to education going to be fulfilled? It can only occur if resources and labor are forced out of people. And that is violence. Libertarianism. That's the heart of the libertarian theory, the so-called principle of non-aggression. It is illegitimate, unethical to initiate force against a person and or their legitimately owned property. In short, in layperson's terms, violence is wrong. It's not very sophisticated. But it doesn't matter who you work for. It doesn't matter whether you intend to do good things by your violence. So, this is why libertarians believe in either no government, anarcho-capitalism, or in a limited government, minarchy, where the state does nothing more than attempt to protect our natural negative rights. Why so? Because the attempt to do more will inevitably result in violence, as history has repeatedly shown. And we should be reminded that this is actually a Christian idea. Jesus and the early church despised violence and the use of force. Their life and teaching were characterized by peace and refusing to use the sword and state power, not known for legitimizing violence to achieve some ideal of love or equality. Evil cannot and should not be fought with evil. So I've outlined what I mean by justice and injustice, by rights, by libertarianism, and non-aggression. Lastly, I want to look at this term, redistribution, or distribution. Redistributing wealth, you hear this term all the time. The basic idea in a democratic socialist or social welfare model is that the world would be a better place if we could just shave off a little bit of the excess wealth from the upper class. There we go, the animation does work. And just give it to the lower class in the form of cash or helpful programs. I mean, really, who needs $200 million yachts and silver-plated cars? Or condominiums for the gang, etc. Those resources, and give it to those who really need it. That's just the idea. Just take it for those who don't really need it, give it to those who do. Sounds like a great idea. I mean, who would be so silly as to object to this? Well, I object. And as have countless other Christians and economists throughout history. Here's why. Number one, it's fundamentally unethical. Notice the word take. In other words, steal. If I walk over to my neighbor's garage and I steal her car, it is theft whether she has $5 in the bank or $5 billion in the bank. I have initiated force against a person's property. I have violated a person's natural negative rights, and I have acted outside the moral vision of Jesus in the New Testament. Now, some will say theft is okay if the resource isn't being used, or if no one gets hurt, or if it benefits the poor, or the collective, or some other ideal. I disagree. Justice cannot be established by large-scale, systematic injustice. Number two, it encourages immorality. Since the redistributors are in the business of theft, they will tend to attract those whose consciences are okay with theft. This is why it's partly disturbing why Jesus actually hung out with tax collectors. It's also why leaders of socialist governments are notoriously corrupt. Additionally, how can we expect the redistributors to be less greedy than the wealthy 1%? Trillions of dollars are centralized, controlled, and pass through their very human hands. My question is this: who is really morally qualified to do that? Number three, it encourages class warfare. The wealthy 1% are not going to be happy when their possessions are confiscated and given to others. They will probably come to resent the underclass for this reason, not become genuinely concerned. They will also resent those who have not been officially declared wealthy by the state and thus escape penalties. After all, these qualifications, in the words of John Rawls, are, quote, a matter of political judgment guided by theory, good sense, and plain hunch. Unquote. Number four, it's incoherent. This model requires the very thing it's trying to eliminate, inequality, a monopoly on power and wealth. The wealthy are not simply going to hand over their excess. It has to be taken by force. This means the redistributor will have to be more powerful, and likely more wealthy than this elitist minority. But why would we want to create yet another monopoly? This time something even more powerful and more affluent than the most powerful people in society. I thought this was the problem. Number five, it's violent. The wealthy did not necessarily gain their elite status by force, but the redistributor always does. I have a choice whether I will say yes or no to the food offered to me by Walmart or Safeway or whatever. Not so with the redistributor. Whatever offers they make, 1 bowl of rice per day, you have to take it. You have to accept it. Otherwise, you'll be punished. Number six, it's inefficient. How will the redistributors know if they're overtaking or misdistributing? There's no system of profit and loss. This is what's called the calculation problem of socialism. And also, what is to stop them if they do misdistribute or over-distribute? The redistributors are the one who determine the quote-unquote right amount of money and who will receive the funds in the first place. They're right, but ipso facto. After facing this problem, John Rawls, in his Theory of Justice, says, quote, perhaps only a rough and approximate solution is possible. I shall, however, leave aside this problem. How ironic, as 20 million people died of starvation precisely from this problem in Rawls' lifetime. It's very ironic. Number seven, it's expensive and wasteful. It's similar to the other one, but a little bit different. Big point here. Redistributing wealth is not free. It's extremely expensive. Huge portions, even the majority of collected taxes, do not terminate in a meaningful relationship to anyone. They're spent on interest on debt, unproductive wars, and Federal Reserve notes that ultimately empower the true wealthy 1%. The process of redistribution requires a massive apparatus of employees, bureaus, regulators, mathematicians, proprietary software programs, boards that naturally centralize more and more power and resources away from the populace. Number 8, it discourages productivity and destroys wealth. I own several small businesses, and I come from a family of small business owners. And all of us share the same discontent: taxes, especially progressive taxes, which, by the way, we should remember is the second pillar of the Communist Manifesto. What's wrong with progressive taxes? Well, it discourages us to produce. Why help more people? Why build another apartment complex? Why collect more food, sell more milk, help more people if you get penalized for it? Number 9, it encourages and creates poverty. This entire system of welfare rewards people based on how poor they are. The poorer you are, the more cash and benefits you get. Why work and try to improve your life so you can lose your benefits and start paying taxes? It's no surprise that poverty tends to increase where welfare programs increase. Number 10, it immediately threatens jobs. Just who is building the $200 million yachts and the silver-plated cars? Who is taking care of the 1%'s wealth, watering their gardens, making their beds, taking their kids to school, feeding them food? Who are these people? Whether we like it or not, harming employers harms employees. And finally, number 11, it adopts an irrational view of poverty. Poverty is not simply the lack of money. Poverty involves an entire arrangement and culture lacking emotional, relational, spiritual, mental resources and support systems. If poverty could be fixed simply by throwing money at it, it would have been eliminated a long time ago. So you can see then that at least there are some serious problems with this social welfare redistribution of wealth schema, at least in theory. But what about in actuality? Thankfully, we don't have to speculate. It's 2016. We live right after the century of socialist and welfare experiments of every kind in multiple countries, cultures, leadership styles, languages. And what has been the consistent result? Forced famines, gulags, the Great Depression, catastrophic environmental disasters of every kind, and 80 million deaths at the hands of the state, either directly from starvation or the typical means of firing squads, gas chambers, etc. In short, the most violent century in human history. And that excludes 2 world wars. Well, maybe there's a correlation, not causation. Maybe if we had the right people in charge, maybe if we added elections to the system, this would fix things. I beg to differ. Consider one case study. Venezuela. Venezuela was one of the most thriving economies in South America, rich in natural resources, had huge reserves of oil, competing even with Saudi Arabia. But federal administrators saw that there was still some hunger and inequality, so instead of letting people continue to serve one another, respect their worth, their rights, Chavez implemented what he called socialism for the 21st century, a slew of government programs and price controls, the ultimate social safety net. Today, this plan has come into fruition. As of 3 weeks ago, a dozen eggs cost $150 US. Inflation is in triple digits. The IMF says 700%. And riots and violence are constant. Reuters World News just posted a new article 3 hours ago about its dangerous situation. And the people are so hungry they're breaking into zoos and slaughtering horses for food. But look at the bright side. Economic equality was largely achieved. Now, maybe if this was a more advanced country, things would turn out better, like the US. I encourage you to go visit your local Indian reservation. This is the place where the government takes care of an oppressed people. You'll find living conditions of a third world country, a destroyed and humiliated culture, and the highest teenage suicide rate in the entire planet. So what's the story behind all this? Well, you see, when God died in the late 1800s, the state ascended the throne and took on the classic divine attributes of omnipotence and omniscience. What the feds decree shall come to pass. Caesar is Lord. Of course, the state is not God, and the mere passing of a law does not create a reality. Poverty cannot be eradicated by making it illegal. Let me say that again. Poverty cannot be eradicated by making it illegal. And for the same reasons, wealth cannot be created by making it mandatory. But this is precisely what the Affordable Health Care Act, minimum wage, countless other irrational pieces of legislation assume. And the results always hurt the people they're intended to help. Always harms the people they're intended to help. As if it needed to be stated, government welfare, or Rawls' words, social choice, has nothing to do with welfare. It is merely another political means of establishing control over a population. In this case, by making citizens physically dependent on the state. As a case in point, welfare programs in the U.S. were established in 1968 in the War Against Poverty. 12 years later, poverty increased a whopping 22%. If this were any other business, the pain would end. It would fail, it would dissolve, and that would be it. But since this is the state, failure is rewarded with more cash. Just as lower graduating literacy rates in public schools entitles the school to more funding, so the increase in poverty from welfare programs entitles those agencies to more funding as well. It's a vicious cycle that thrives on failure. Thus, today, 20% of Americans, ironically the same ratio of slaves in the Roman Empire, are on food stamps. Soon it'll be 40%. Then 60%. Then eventually 100%. And soon enough, food, housing, education, college, hot tubs, cars will all be free, and employment will be an effective 100%, and America will finally be as wealthy as North Korea. It is no surprise. I have to put up that meme. Sorry. It is no surprise that Jesus and the early church never called upon someone else to take care of the needy. They saw themselves as responsible. They didn't fall into what Scott McKnight calls the Constantinian temptation, using coercion of the state for religious reasons. The countless hospitals, orphanages, nonprofits, businesses that have emerged without help or even permission from the state is continual testimony of how effective the church can be. It is unfortunate, writes Brent Waters in a recent book, that many churches regard themselves to be, in effect, voluntary organizations. It's something they pursue in their spare time. The work of the church is reduced to a small domain. This is a highly impoverished understanding of the church. How sad, then, when I spoke with a Canadian Christian, my age, a couple years ago, who remarked, "Why should I give to charity? I do that with taxes. The government takes care of the poor, not me." This is exactly what French economist Friedrich Bastiat called false philanthropy over 150 years ago. Jesus and the early church distanced themselves from Caesar and trivialized the state's authority because they recognized its inherent ineffectiveness and violent nature. Governments are simply groups of people with a territorial monopoly on force. Or in Stalin's words, quote, "The state is a special machine for the suppression of one class by another." The new covenant community, the kingdom of God, is fundamentally the opposite. A society marked by peace, voluntarism, mutuality, cooperation, freedom, and sharing. Sharing, I suppose I have to clarify, assumes property rights and is always voluntary. Just as grace would not be grace if it can be demanded, just as forced conversions to any religion aren't true conversions, so charity is no longer charity when it's forced. Again, paying taxes is not charity. As 2 Corinthians 9:7 notes, each one should give just as they have purposed in their heart, not grudgingly or under compulsion." Unquote. I want to close with the words of Prime Minister Abraham Kuyper in his book, The Problem of Poverty. "Never forget that all state relief for the poor is a blot on the honor of your Savior. The fact that the government needs a safety net to catch those who would slip between the cracks of our economic system is evidence that I have failed to do God's work. The government cannot take the place of Christian charity. A loving embrace isn't given with food stamps. The care of a community isn't provided with government housing. The face of our Creator can't be seen on a welfare voucher. What the poor need is not another government program. What they need is for Christians like me to honor our Savior." Thank you.